They saw what they wanted to see, a ragged woman on an old bay mare, haunting the western trails like a desert ghost. The Blackwood Gang laughed when travelers spoke of her in whispers, when nervous merchants claimed she watched from distant ridges. After all, what threat could one broken woman pose to the most feared outlaws in the territory? They didn't see the precision-worn holsters beneath her coat, didn't notice how her horse moved with unnatural silence, or how those haunted eyes studied everything. They couldn't know that Sarah Mason wasn't just tracking them. She was teaching others to fight back, building an army from the very people they thought were prey. Now, as the gang terrorizes another group of travelers on a remote desert trail, they're about to learn why hardened criminals still speak her name in fear. Why the ghost of Mason County isn't just seeking revenge for her murdered family. She's coming to tear down an empire of violence, one lesson at a time. And by the time the Blackwood Gang realizes the truth, it will be far too late. Just before we get back to it, I'd love to know where you're watching from today. And if you're enjoying these stories, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow's special episode is one you definitely don't want to miss. The morning sun cast long shadows across the desert trail as a group of travelers gathered their belongings, preparing for what promised to be an arduous journey ahead. The air was thick with tension and the lingering coolness of dawn, a stark contrast to the scorching heat that would soon envelope them. Marcus Reed, a bounty hunter known more for his boisterous voice than his actual achievements, adjusted the worn leather holster at his hip. His weathered face broke into a cocky grin as he surveyed the assembled group. "Well, ain't this just the sorriest bunch of trail companions I've ever laid eyes on?" he declared, his voice carrying across the campsite. The comment drew a nervous laugh from Timothy Brooks, a merchant whose silk vest and polished boots seemed woefully out of place in the rugged terrain. His fingers fidgeted with the brass buttons of his coat as he glanced anxiously at the rocky path ahead. "Surely the trail can't be as dangerous as they say," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. Hannah Wells, the group's healer, looked up from where she was carefully packing her medicinal herbs into a leather satchel. Her gentle features carried a hint of reproach as she addressed Marcus. "Perhaps instead of mocking your companions, you could help ensure everyone's prepared for the journey." Her calm voice carried an undertone of wisdom that belied her young age. "I don't need advice from a healer who's probably never seen anything worse than a scraped knee," Marcus scoffed, but there was less bite in his words than before. Hannah simply shook her head and returned to her task, checking that her precious herbs were secured properly. The fourth member of their core group, a wanderer who had introduced himself simply as Hank, stood slightly apart from the others. His gray eyes constantly scanned the horizon, missing nothing. "The weather's turning," he observed quietly, nodding toward the gathering clouds in the distance. "We should move while we still can." As the group began their journey, they were joined by several other travelers who had been camping nearby. 3 merchants with a wagon full of trade goods, a young couple seeking a new life in the Western Territories, and 2 sisters who claimed to be traveling to visit family. The expanded group moved slowly along the trail, their passage marked by the crunch of boots on gravel and the occasional creak of wagon wheels. The morning wore on, and the weather deteriorated exactly as Hank had predicted. Wind whipped across the landscape, carrying stinging particles of dust that forced the travelers to shield their faces with cloth and scarves. The conversation dwindled to occasional grunts and muttered complaints about the conditions. "This is madness," one of the merchant's sisters, Mary Beth Crawford, grumbled, pulling her shawl tighter around her shoulders. "We should have waited for better weather. And risk running out of supplies?" Marcus shot back. "The next trading post is still 4 days ahead. Unless you're planning to eat rocks and drink sand, we keep moving." The wind's howl suddenly died down, replaced by an eerie stillness that made the hairs on the back of Hank's neck stand up. He raised his hand, signaling the group to stop. Through the settling dust, a lone figure appeared on the horizon, a rider on horseback, moving at an unhurried pace. As the figure drew closer, details began to emerge through the hazy air. The horse was an old bay mare, its coat dull and its gait steady but unremarkable. Its rider sat straight in the saddle, wrapped in a dust-colored coat that had seen better days. The woman's face was partially hidden by a wide-brimmed hat, but what was visible appeared weathered and lined, her hair unkempt and streaked with gray despite her seemingly middle age. Marcus let out a loud laugh that shattered the silence. "Well, would you look at that? The desert's gone and sent us its very own ghost." His voice carried across the distance, causing the woman's horse to flick its ears but maintain its steady pace. Timothy Brooks shifted uncomfortably, his eyes drawn to the woman's holstered weapons, well maintained despite her otherwise rough appearance. There was something about the way she carried herself, a quiet confidence that seemed at odds with her ragged exterior. Probably some crazy old hermit, Elizabeth Crawford, Mary Beth's sister, whispered, though her voice wasn't quite low enough to avoid carrying. Living out here alone would drive anyone mad. The woman drew closer, and Marcus, encouraged by the scattered laughter from the group, stepped forward with an exaggerated bow. "Welcome, O mighty spirit of the wasteland. Have you come to bless our humble journey with your—" He paused for dramatic effect. "Magnificent presence?" The woman's horse came to a stop several paces from the group. Up close, her eyes were startlingly clear and sharp, scanning the assembled travelers with an intensity that made several of them shift uncomfortably. She said nothing, but her gaze lingered on each face as if memorizing their features. Hannah Wells stepped forward, offering a water skin. "The trail is long and the day is hot. Would you like to—" "Leave her be," Marcus interrupted. "Can't you see she's busy being mysterious and important?" He turned to the woman with a mocking grin. "Tell me, do you practice that stern look in whatever mud puddle you use for a mirror?" The woman's expression remained unchanged as she gently nudged her horse forward, moving through the group without acknowledging their taunts or Hannah's offered kindness. As she passed, Timothy caught a glimpse of something else beneath the dust and where, scars on her hands that spoke of combat, and the way her eyes constantly tracked movement, missing nothing. "Did you see those weapons?" Timothy whispered to Hank. "They're not just for show. The way they're worn—" "Quiet," Hank muttered back. "Some things are better left unspoken." His eyes followed the woman as she rode past, and a frown creased his weathered features. The woman had nearly passed through their group when young Billy Tucker, one of the merchants emboldened by Marcus's example, called out, "Hey, witch, did you leave your broom at home?" She stopped then, just for a moment, and turned in her saddle. Her eyes found the young merchant, who suddenly seemed to shrink under her gaze. The silence stretched for several heartbeats before she turned away and continued riding, her horse's hoofbeats fading into the wind. "There's something not right about her," Hank murmured, more to himself than the others. "Something in those eyes." "Oh, not you too," Marcus groaned. "Next you'll be telling us she's some legendary figure come to either save or doom us all. She's just some crazy woman who's spent too much time in the sun. Nothing more." The group laughed, though some of the laughter held a nervous edge. They resumed their journey, the incident already becoming another tale to share around the evening campfire. Yet Timothy noticed how Hank kept glancing back, watching the dust trail that marked the woman's passage until it disappeared into the gathering haze. The day wore on, and the wind picked up again, carrying with it the promise of worse weather to come. The travelers pulled their coats tighter and pressed forward, their earlier mirth forgotten in the face of the challenging conditions. The woman became just another strange encounter on a long and difficult trail, or so they thought. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the rocky terrain, Hannah Wells found herself wondering about the woman's eyes. There had been something in them, not madness as the others suggested, but purpose. The kind of purpose that came from carrying a heavy burden for far too long. Marcus's voice cut through her thoughts. "Make camp here," he called out, pointing to a relatively sheltered area beneath a rocky outcropping. "Unless anyone else wants to share their opinion about our mysterious visitor." He laughed again, but this time few joined in. The travelers began setting up their camp for the night, unaware that they had just encountered someone who would soon change their lives forever. As they huddled around their campfires, sharing meals and stories, none of them noticed the distant silhouette on a ridge overlooking their camp. A lone rider on an old bay mare, watching silently before disappearing into the gathering darkness. The wind continued to howl through the rocks, carrying with it the first hints of the danger that lay ahead. But for now, the travelers remained oblivious, their laughter echoing across the desert as they mocked their mysterious encounter, unaware that their journey was about to take a turn they could never have anticipated. Timothy Brooks stayed awake longer than the others that night, his merchant's mind turning over the details he had noticed. The precision-worn holsters, the calculating eyes, the way she had evaluated each member of their group. He said nothing of his thoughts, but sleep was long in coming, and when it did, his dreams were filled with the image of those penetrating eyes, watching and waiting. The sunrise painted the desert sky in shades of amber and rose, casting long shadows across the travelers' camp as they stirred from their uneasy sleep. Timothy Brooks' dreams of penetrating eyes and mysterious riders faded into the morning light, replaced by the immediate concerns of breaking camp and getting back on the trail. The night's chill still clung to the air, a deceptive respite from the heat that would soon follow. Marcus Reed was already up, his figure silhouetted against the brightening horizon as he checked his weapons with practiced precision. His usual bravado seemed somewhat subdued this morning, though none of the others mentioned it. Perhaps the strange encounter with the mysterious woman the day before had affected him more than he cared to admit. "Looks like something's caught on that old oak up ahead," Hannah Wells called out, pointing to a weather-beaten tree that stood like a lonely sentinel about 50 yards from their camp. The tree's gnarled branches reached toward the sky like pleading fingers, and something indeed fluttered from one of its lower limbs. Hank's hand instinctively moved to his rifle as they approached the tree. "Stay alert," he muttered, his eyes scanning the surrounding terrain. The morning breeze carried a hint of unease, rustling through the sparse vegetation with an almost mournful sound. As they drew closer, the fluttering object revealed itself to be a wanted poster, its edges torn and weathered by the elements. Timothy reached up and carefully pulled it free from the rusty nail that held it to the trunk. The paper was yellow with age, but the images printed on it were still clear enough to send a chill down his spine. "The Blackwood Gang," Mary Beth Crawford whispered, peering over Timothy's shoulder at the poster. The paper showed several faces, rough-looking men with cold eyes and cruel smiles. The reward amount listed beneath their pictures made Timothy's merchant heart skip a beat. It was enough money to set someone up for life. Elizabeth Crawford's face paled as she studied the poster. "I've heard of them. They're the ones who massacred that wagon train near Fort Hamilton last spring. Didn't leave anyone alive, not even the children." Her voice trembled slightly as she spoke. Marcus snatched the poster from Timothy's hands, his eyes narrowing as he studied the faces. $20,000 for the lot of them, dead or alive. Now that's the kind of bounty worth pursuing. Despite his words, there was a note of uncertainty in his voice that hadn't been there before. Hannah moved closer to examine the poster herself, her healer's eyes taking in the details others might miss. "These men, they're not just outlaws. Look at their eyes. There's something worse there. Something empty." Billy Tucker, the young merchant who had mocked the mysterious woman the day before, nervously cleared his throat. "I heard they have some kind of ritual. They mark their territory before they strike, leave signs to terrorize their victims before they attack." "Superstitious nonsense," Marcus scoffed, but his hand remained near his holster as they continued down the trail. The wanted poster found its way into his saddlebag, though nobody commented on this action. It was Hank who first noticed the marks on the trees. They were traveling through a section of the trail where the terrain grew more wooded, the desert gradually giving way to scattered groves of stunted trees. The marks were deep gouges in the bark, too uniform to be natural, too deliberate to be random. "These ain't animal marks," Hank declared, running his fingers over the scarred wood. "Someone made these, and recently too. The wood's still fresh underneath." He exchanged a meaningful look with Timothy, who remembered their brief discussion about the mysterious woman's weapons the day before. The group's progress slowed as they found more signs along the trail. Boot prints that appeared and disappeared mysteriously, broken branches that seemed to point in specific directions, and more of those deliberate marks on the trees. The cheerful banter that had characterized their journey the previous day was replaced by tense silence, broken only by the creak of wagon wheels and the occasional nervous whisper. Around midday, they came upon the abandoned campsite. The sight stopped them dead in their tracks, the horror of what lay before them seeping into their bones like the desert cold. The ground was stained dark in places, supplies scattered as if thrown in panic. A cooking pot still hung over the cold remains of a fire, its contents long since dried to a crusty residue. "Nobody move," Marcus commanded, his voice carrying an authority that none had heard before. This wasn't that long ago. Whoever did this might still be around. He drew his revolver, the metal catching the sunlight with a dangerous gleam. Hannah moved forward despite Marcus's warning, her healer's instincts overriding caution. She knelt beside one of the dark stains, her experienced eyes taking in the scene. "This blood is at least 2 days old," she said quietly. "But there are no bodies. Why would they take the bodies?" The question hung in the air like gunsmoke, nobody willing to voice the possibilities that sprang to mind. Timothy found himself examining the scattered supplies with a merchant's eye, noting what was taken and what was left behind. "They didn't take anything of real value," he observed. "Left the silver, the trading goods." This wasn't about robbery. It was about sending a message. Hank finished the thought, his weathered face grim. He pointed to more marks carved into a nearby tree, similar to the ones they'd seen earlier, but larger, more pronounced. "They want people to know they were here. Want them to be afraid." Mary Beth clutched her sister's arm, her earlier complaints about the weather forgotten in the face of this new horror. "We should turn back," she whispered. "Better to lose our trading season than our lives." Marcus holstered his weapon with deliberate slowness, his earlier bravado replaced by something harder, more professional. "Turning back means crossing 50 miles of open desert with dwindling supplies. We push forward, but we change how we travel. No more spreading out, no more casual pace. We move as a unit, weapons ready." The group huddled closer together as they continued their journey, the abandoned campsite etched into their memories like a brand. The day grew hotter, the sun beating down mercilessly, but nobody complained about the heat anymore. They had bigger concerns now. It was early afternoon when they spotted her again, the mysterious woman on her old bay mare, riding parallel to their trail about a quarter-mile to the north. Her presence, which had inspired mockery the day before, now brought an odd sense of comfort to some members of the group, though none would admit it openly. "Should we try to signal her?" Hannah suggested, watching the distant rider through narrowed eyes. "She might know something about what's happening on this trail." Marcus spat into the dust. "And risk drawing attention to ourselves? For all we know, she's working with them, scouting for easy targets." But his words lacked conviction, and his eyes kept straying to the lone figure on the ridge. "She's been following the same signs we have," Hank observed quietly. "Notice how she stops at certain points? She's tracking something. Or someone." The implications of his words sent a shiver through the group despite the afternoon heat. As the day wore on, they found more signs of violence along the trail, abandoned personal effects, more ominous marks on trees, and twice more the remains of camps that had been attacked. Each site told the same story: sudden violence, missing victims, and an almost theatrical arrangement of the evidence left behind. Billy Tucker, who had been unusually quiet since finding the wanted poster, finally spoke up. "My pa used to say that predators mark their territory before they hunt. Said it was like they were claiming the land, telling other predators to stay away." His young face was drawn with worry. "These marks we're seeing, they're not just signs. They're warnings." The sun was beginning to set when they came across the fresh tracks. Multiple horses, moving fast, heading east across their trail. The tracks couldn't have been more than a few hours old, the edges still sharp in the sandy soil. "At least 8 riders," Hank announced after examining the tracks. "Maybe more." They crossed here, heading toward the canyon lands. He looked up at the darkening sky, his expression troubled. "We need to make camp soon, but not here. This is too exposed." They pushed on until they found a more defensible position, a small rise backed by steep rocks, providing some protection from behind. As they set up camp, the mood was somber. Gone was the casual circle of bedrolls. Instead, they arranged themselves in a tight cluster, weapons close at hand. The night seemed to press in around their campfire, the darkness beyond their little circle of light feeling thicker than usual. Every sound, a distant coyote's howl, the wind through the rocks, the crack of a cooling ember, caused hands to tighten on weapons and heads to turn sharply. Timothy found himself on first watch alongside Hank, both men scanning the darkness for any sign of movement. "That woman," Timothy said quietly. "She knew about this, didn't she? That's why she was watching us yesterday." Hank nodded slowly. "Figure she's been on their trail for a while." Did you notice how well-maintained her weapons were, despite everything else about her looking trail-worn? Those weren't for show. He paused, listening to something in the distance. Question is, what's she hunting them for? Bounty, revenge, or something else entirely? The night wore on, and the watches changed. Hannah took her turn alongside Marcus, who had been uncharacteristically quiet since they'd found the first abandoned camp. "Your shot at her yesterday," Hannah said softly, "about never seeing anything worse than a scraped knee? I've seen plenty worse. Treated folks who'd survived attacks like the ones we saw today. Some wounds don't show on the outside." Marcus was quiet for a long moment before responding. "Way I figure it, there's seeing bad things, and then there's choosing to hunt them down. That woman, whatever else she might be, she's chosen to hunt something real dark. Takes a certain kind of person to make that choice." The night passed without incident, but sleep was scarce among the travelers. Every rustle of wind brought images of the abandoned camps. Every shadow held the potential for danger. When dawn finally broke, it found them already breaking camp, eager to be moving despite their fatigue. As they resumed their journey, Timothy noticed something had changed in the group dynamic. The easy camaraderie of their first day had been replaced by something more primal, a pack mentality born of shared fear and the instinct for survival. Even Marcus's usual swagger had been tempered by the reality of their situation. They hadn't traveled far when Billy Tucker spotted something that made his blood run cold. Fresh claw marks on a tree, the wood still oozing sap. These weren't like the others they'd seen. These had been made within the last hour. The group unconsciously drew closer together, weapons ready, eyes scanning the surrounding terrain. And there, on a distant ridge, they saw her again, the mysterious woman, her silhouette clear against the morning sky. This time, she wasn't just passing by. She sat her horse perfectly still, watching their group with an intensity they could feel even at this distance. "She's trying to tell us something," Hannah said, her voice barely above a whisper. "She's been following these signs too, probably longer than we have. She knows what's coming." Marcus gripped his reins tighter, his knuckles white. "Well, if she knows so much, why doesn't she come down here and tell us? Why all this mystery and shadow play?" "Because sometimes," Hank replied, his eyes fixed on the distant rider, "the warning is all you can give. Some lessons folks have to learn the hard way." He checked his rifle for the fourth time that morning. "Question is, are we going to be smart enough to heed the warning?" The woman remained on the ridge for several more minutes before turning her horse and disappearing from view, leaving the travelers to ponder their next move. The day stretched ahead of them, full of uncertainty and danger, and somewhere out there, the authors of those violent camps were waiting, watching, marking their territory like the predators they were. The mysterious woman's presence had transformed from an object of ridicule to a harbinger of something far more sinister. And as they pressed on, each member of the group couldn't help but wonder if they'd already passed the point of no return. The day's dying light painted long shadows across the travelers' camp as they settled in for what promised to be another tense night. Fresh claw marks on nearby trees and the mysterious woman's warning presence earlier that day had left everyone on edge. They'd chosen their campsite carefully, a natural alcove formed by towering rock formations, with clear lines of sight in all directions and only one obvious approach. Marcus Reed sat cleaning his revolver by the campfire, his movements methodical and precise. The weapon had already been cleaned twice since sunset, but the ritual seemed to calm his nerves. His earlier bravado had been replaced by a quiet vigilance that the others found more unsettling than his usual boasting. "You're wearing down that rag," Hannah Wells observed softly, settling beside him with a cup of coffee. The healer had spent the evening preparing extra bandages and poultices, her own way of dealing with the growing tension. "Rather wear down the rag than be caught unprepared," Marcus replied without looking up. He held the cylinder up to the firelight, checking each chamber one final time. "Something ain't right about tonight. Air feels wrong." Hank, who had been watching the darkness beyond their camp, nodded in agreement. "Winds died down too much. Usually get stronger after sunset out here, not weaker." His weathered hand rested on his rifle, finger tapping in a regular rhythm against the stock. Timothy Brooks finished his evening meal in silence, his merchant's mind calculating distances to the nearest settlements, escape routes, and survival odds. The Crawford sisters huddled together nearby, speaking in whispers, while Billy Tucker paced nervously at the edge of the firelight. The first hour of darkness passed without incident. Then the second. The fire burned low, and the night pressed in around them like a living thing. The moon had risen, nearly full, casting an ethereal glow across the desert landscape. Under different circumstances, it might have been beautiful. The attack, when it came, started with a sound so subtle that most of them almost missed it. The soft clink of a horse's bit in the darkness. Hank's head snapped up, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the shadows. "Something's," he began, but the rest of his warning was drowned out by the first gunshot. The bullet kicked up dust near the fire, sending sparks flying. The travelers scattered for cover as more shots rang out, the sounds echoing off the rock walls around them. Through the chaos, Timothy caught glimpses of mounted figures moving in the darkness, their shapes black against the starlit sky. "Get to the rocks," Marcus bellowed, returning fire with his revolver. The sound was deafening in the confined space. "Don't bunch up. Make yourself hard to hit." Hannah grabbed her medical bag and dove behind a boulder, pulling Mary Beth Crawford with her. Elizabeth Crawford wasn't as lucky. A bullet caught her in the arm as she ran, spinning her around with a cry of pain. Billy Tucker darted out from his cover and dragged her to safety, showing unexpected courage. The attackers were closer now, their features visible in the moonlight. They matched the faces from the wanted poster, the Blackwood Gang, in the flesh. Their leader, a massive man with a scarred face, directed his men with sharp hand gestures as they tightened their circle around the camp. 8 of them, Hank muttered, working the lever of his rifle with practiced efficiency. Maybe more hanging back. He fired, and one of the mounted figures pitched backward out of his saddle. The gang's response was immediate and brutal. A volley of shots forced the defenders deeper into cover as several gang members dismounted and began advancing on foot. Their movements were coordinated, professional. This was no random bandit attack. "You folks picked the wrong trail to travel," the gang leader called out, his voice carrying easily across the battlefield. "But don't worry, we'll make it quick. Mostly quick anyway." The laughter that followed sent chills down Timothy's spine. Marcus had worked his way to a better position, using the confusion to his advantage. He managed to wing one of the advancing gang members, but the victory was short-lived. 2 more appeared from the darkness, forcing him back with concentrated fire. "Hannah." Elizabeth Crawford's voice was tight with pain. "The bleeding won't stop." The healer looked at the distance between her position and Elizabeth's, calculating the risk. Before she could move, Billy Tucker stripped off his shirt and tossed it to her. "Use this," he shouted. "I'll draw their fire." The young merchant darted out from cover, firing his pistol wildly into the night. The distraction worked. Several gang members turned to track his movement, giving Hannah the chance to reach Elizabeth with her supplies. But the gang was too many, too well armed. They had the high ground now, and their shots were getting closer. Timothy could see the end approaching, written in the dwindling ammunition and the growing confidence of their attackers. Then everything changed. The first sign was a strange whistling sound, followed by a thud and a gurgled cry from the darkness. One of the gang members toppled forward, an arrow protruding from his throat. Before his body hit the ground, 2 more arrows found their marks with deadly precision. "What the hell?" The gang leader's voice carried a note of genuine surprise. His men's attention wavered, turning toward this new threat. That's when she appeared. The mysterious woman emerged from the shadows like a spirit of vengeance, her movement fluid and purposeful. Gone was the ragged appearance that had drawn their mockery days before. Now she moved with lethal grace, a revolver in one hand and a short carbine in the other. Her first shots dropped 2 more gang members before they could react. The gang leader bellowed orders, trying to reorganize his men to face this new threat. But she was already moving again, using the darkness and confusion to her advantage. "The ghost! It's the damn ghost!" One of the gang members cried out, real fear in his voice. He turned to run and caught a bullet for his trouble. The woman's presence had completely disrupted the gang's coordinated attack. They were shooting wildly now, their earlier precision replaced by panic. She seemed to be everywhere and nowhere, each appearance marked by another fallen attacker. Marcus, quick to recognize the turning tide, rallied the travelers. Push them back. Don't let them regroup. He broke cover, firing steadily, forcing the remaining gang members away from their positions. The gang leader, seeing his advantage crumbling, made a desperate charge toward the woman's position. She met him head-on, ducking under his wild shot and slamming the butt of her carbine into his knee. The big man went down hard, but he was far from finished. His hand flashed out, catching her ankle and pulling her off balance. The two rolled in the dust, trading blows with brutal efficiency. The gang leader was stronger, but the woman was quicker, slipping away from his grasp like smoke. She took a heavy hit to the ribs, but answered with an elbow strike that broke his nose in a spray of blood. Their struggle ended with shocking suddenness. A flash of steel in the moonlight, a muffled grunt, and then stillness. The woman rose slowly, wiping a knife blade clean on the gang leader's shirt. The remaining gang members, seeing their leader fall, broke and ran into the night. For a long moment, nobody moved. The woman stood motionless, her breathing steady despite the exertion of the fight. Then she turned to the travelers, her eyes as piercing as they remembered from their first encounter. "Get your wounded ready to move," she said, her voice rough from disuse, but carrying clear authority. "More will come when these don't report back." Hannah was already working on Elizabeth's arm, her skilled hands moving with practiced efficiency. "The wound's clean through," she reported. "She can travel, but she'll need rest soon." The woman nodded once, then moved to check the fallen gang members with professional thoroughness. She collected weapons and ammunition, dropping a share near Marcus without comment. "You're her, aren't you?" Timothy asked, finding his voice at last. "The ghost tracker they talk about in the border towns?" She paused in her work but didn't answer directly. Instead, she said, "You should have turned back when you saw the signs. The gang's been hunting these trails for months. Why didn't you warn us directly?" Billy Tucker demanded, some of his earlier bravado returning now that the danger had passed. The woman secured the last of the weapons and turned to face him. "Would you have believed me? Or would you have just mocked me again, like you did before?" The young merchant's face flushed red in the darkness. Marcus stepped forward, holstering his revolver with deliberate care. "Thank you," he said simply, his usual swagger notably absent. "We'd be dead if not for you." "Don't thank me yet," she replied, checking her own weapons with practiced efficiency. "The night's not over, and we're still in their hunting grounds." She whistled softly, and her old bay mare emerged from the shadows, as quiet as its rider. "What do we do now?" Mary Beth asked, supporting her sister as Hannah finished bandaging the wound. The woman swung into her saddle, the movement fluid despite the injury she'd sustained in the fight. "Now you make a choice. Keep going forward and risk meeting more of them, or turn back and brave the desert you just crossed." "Those aren't good options," Hank observed grimly. "No," she agreed, "they're not. But they're the only ones you've got." She turned her horse, preparing to ride. "I'll scout ahead, try to draw off any others in the area. Make your choice quick. You've got about an hour before the moon sets." "Wait," Hannah called out. "Your ribs. Let me look at them. That was a hard hit you took." The woman shook her head. "No time. Your group needs to move." She paused, then added, "If you decide to go forward, stay off the main trail. Follow the dry creek bed east until you hit the old mission ruins. You might find help there." With that, she was gone, melting into the darkness as silently as she had appeared. The travelers stood in stunned silence, the events of the last hour feeling almost unreal in the quiet that followed. "Well," Marcus said finally, checking his newly acquired ammunition, "guess we owe that ragged ghost an apology." He looked around at the group, his expression serious. "So, what's it to be? Forward or back?" Timothy studied the bodies of the fallen gang members, remembering the woman's efficient violence and the fear in the outlaws' voices when they recognized her. "She could have left us to die," he said slowly. "Instead, she came back to help the same people who mocked her. She's hunting them," Hank added, "but she took time to save us. That says something about her character." The group looked at each other, each face showing the weight of the decision before them. The night stretched out around them, full of hidden dangers, and somewhere in that darkness, their mysterious savior was drawing fire away from them at great personal risk. As they prepared to make their choice, each traveler knew that whatever path they chose, nothing would be the same after this night. The moon continued its arc across the sky, counting down their hour of decision, while in the distance, a lone rider moved through the darkness, hunting and being hunted, her true purpose still a mystery to those whose lives she had just saved. The pale light of dawn crept across the desert landscape, revealing the aftermath of the night's violence. The travelers had chosen to press forward, following the mysterious woman's advice to take the dry creek bed east. They'd been moving since moonset, their pace slowed by Elizabeth Crawford's injury and their own bone-deep exhaustion. Timothy Brooks led his horse carefully down the creek bed's rocky slope, his merchant's eyes taking in signs of the woman's passing, subtle marks that told him she was keeping her word about scouting ahead. The night's events had transformed his initial curiosity about her into something approaching awe. "There," Hank muttered, pointing to a distant ridge where a familiar silhouette had appeared. The woman sat motionless on her bay mare, watching their progress. Her presence had become a strange comfort rather than a source of mockery, though she maintained her distance. Hannah Wells adjusted the bandage on Elizabeth's arm as they walked, her trained eye noting how the woman favored her right side. "Those ribs she took a hit to last night," she said quietly to Marcus, who walked beside her. "She's hurting more than she let on." Marcus nodded, his usual swagger replaced by professional concern. "Notice that too. Way she's sitting in the saddle, trying to protect her left side. Must be bad if it shows in her posture." He unconsciously touched the extra ammunition she'd given him the night before. "Still can't figure why she came back for us." The morning wore on, the sun climbing higher in the cloudless sky. The creek bed provided some shelter from the heat, its high banks casting welcome shadows. Signs of violence grew more frequent as they progressed. Abandoned camps, hastily buried bodies, and the distinctive claw marks they now recognized as the Blackwood Gang's calling card. Mary Beth supported her sister as they walked, both Crawford sisters unusually quiet after the night's ordeal. "I keep thinking about what she said," Mary Beth finally spoke. "About more of them coming when the others don't report back. How does she know their patterns so well?" Her question was interrupted by Billy Tucker's excited whisper. "Look there. Fresh blood on those rocks. Can't be more than an hour old." The young merchant had developed an unexpected talent for tracking since the attack, his earlier fear transformed into keen observation. Hank examined the blood trail with practiced eyes. "She's been busy, taking them out one by one while we follow behind." He straightened up, squinting at the horizon. "Smart. Keeping us off their main hunting grounds while she whittles down their numbers." Around midday, they stopped to rest in a sheltered bend of the creek bed. The woman's silhouette had disappeared from view, but none doubted she was still watching. Hannah took the opportunity to check Elizabeth's wound properly, cleaning it with precious water from their dwindling supplies. "Tell us about the ghost tracker," Billy Tucker asked suddenly, breaking the tense silence. "The stories you've heard, Mr. Brooks. You're a merchant. You must know something." Timothy shifted uncomfortably, aware that all eyes had turned to him. "It's mostly rumor and whispers," he began. "They say she appeared about 2 years ago, after the Mason County massacres. Started hunting down the worst gangs, the ones who'd given up any pretense of common banditry and turned to pure brutality. I heard she was a survivor," Mary Beth added softly. "Someone who lost everything to one of those gangs and swore revenge." Marcus shook his head. "Revenge doesn't explain her skill. You saw her fight last night. That's years of experience. Military training, maybe, or law enforcement." He paused, remembering the efficiency with which she'd dispatched the gang members. "But there's something personal in it, too. You can see it in her eyes." The conversation died as a cascade of small rocks announced someone's approach. Weapons appeared in hands as if by magic, but it was the woman herself who emerged from behind a bend in the creek bed. She moved with the same fluid grace as the night before, though Hannah's trained eye caught the slight stiffness in her movements. "You need to move," she said without preamble. 4 more riders spotted heading this way. "They'll find the bodies soon." Her voice was still rough from disuse, but there was an underlying tension that hadn't been there before. Hannah stepped forward, medical bag in hand. "Let me look at those ribs first. You're no good to anyone if they're broken." The woman hesitated, something flickering in her eyes. Surprise, perhaps, at the genuine concern in Hannah's voice. After a long moment, she gave a short nod and allowed the healer to approach. As Hannah worked, the others took the opportunity to study their mysterious protector in the daylight. Her clothes, though worn, were carefully maintained for functionality. Scars on her hands and face told stories of past violence, while her weapons showed the kind of wear that came from frequent use rather than neglect. "Why are you helping us?" Timothy finally asked the question that had been burning in all their minds. "You could have left us to our fate last night. Nobody would have blamed you, considering how we treated you." The woman remained silent as Hannah finished binding her ribs, but when she spoke, her words carried the weight of hard-earned wisdom. "There's been enough death on these trails. The Blackwood Gang, they're different from common outlaws. They don't just rob and kill, they enjoy it. Take pride in it. You've been tracking them for a while," Hank observed. It wasn't a question. 8 months, she confirmed, checking her weapons with practiced efficiency. They started in Mason County, working their way south. Each massacre worse than the last. Something dark passed behind her eyes. "They need to be stopped." Mason County, Marcus repeated slowly, a memory stirring. "The settlements that were hit hard last spring. A lot of families." He trailed off, studying the woman's face with new understanding. She met his gaze steadily, neither confirming nor denying the unspoken question. Instead, she said, "They're getting bolder. Used to stay in the wilderness, picking off isolated travelers. Now they're moving closer to populated areas, testing their limits. That's why you're out here alone," Hannah realized, packing away her medical supplies. "You're not just tracking them, you're hunting them, drawing them away from settlements." A ghost of a smile touched the woman's lips. "Smart girl. Yes, I've been leading them on a chase through the backcountry. Every day they spend pursuing me is a day they're not attacking innocent people. But last night," Billy Tucker interjected, "they were focused on us, not you." "Why'd they break pattern?" "Because they're not just killers, they're predators," she explained, her voice hardening. They saw what looked like easy prey, a group of merchants and travelers who didn't know what signs to watch for. Couldn't resist the opportunity. Timothy remembered the fear in the gang member's voice when he'd recognized her. "They called you the ghost last night. They knew who you were." "They know what I am," she corrected. A reminder that their actions have consequences. That someone's willing to hunt the hunters. She checked the position of the sun, calculating time and distance. "We need to move. The mission ruins are about 4 hours ahead if we maintain a steady pace." "What's at the mission?" Mary Beth asked, helping her sister to her feet. "Safety," the woman replied simply. "And answers, for those willing to hear them." She turned to go, but Hannah's voice stopped her. "You never told us your name," the healer said softly. The woman paused, looking back at the group. For a moment, it seemed she might maintain her mystery, but something in Hannah's honest concern seemed to reach her. "Sarah," she said finally. "Sarah Mason." The name hit Marcus like a physical blow. "Mason? As in?" "Yes," she cut him off. "Mason County. My family's ranch was one of the first they hit." Her voice carried no self-pity, only a steel-hard purpose. "I was in town when they came. By the time I got back..." She let the sentence hang unfinished. The silence that followed was heavy with understanding. The woman, Sarah, swung back into her saddle, hiding the grimace of pain the movement caused. "I'll scout ahead, try to draw off any followers. Keep to the creek bed and watch for my signals. If you hear shooting, don't stop moving." With that, she was gone, her horse moving as silently as its rider through the rocky terrain. The travelers watched her go, each processing what they'd learned about their mysterious protector. Mason County, Timothy mused aloud. "I remember when news of those massacres reached the trading posts. They said one ranch hand survived, a woman who'd been away when the gang attacked. The story said she'd sworn a blood oath to hunt down every last member of the gang." "Looks like the stories were true," Hank replied grimly. "Though, I reckon the reality's a far sight harder than the telling." They resumed their journey, following the dry creek bed east as instructed. The revelation of Sarah Mason's identity and purpose had changed something in the group dynamic. Their earlier fear and uncertainty had been replaced by a grim determination to reach the mission ruins, to see this journey through to whatever end awaited them. The sun continued its westward arc, and somewhere ahead of them, a lone rider moved through the desert heat, carrying the weight of vengeance and responsibility with every mile. The fourth act of their journey had revealed the truth behind the mystery, but as they would soon learn, some secrets came with a price that could only be paid in blood. As the afternoon wore on, Mary Beth voiced what many of them were thinking. She could have killed us all that first day, when we mocked her. Would have been easy for someone with her skills. That's the difference between her and them, Hannah responded, adjusting Elizabeth's bandage once more. She chose to protect the same people who ridiculed her. Says more about her character than any story ever could. The mission ruins were still hours away, and the day's heat showed no sign of abating. But the travelers pressed on, their steps now guided not just by fear of what pursued them, but by a growing respect for the woman who'd chosen to stand between them and the darkness that haunted these trails. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly as Sarah Mason led the travelers through a maze of narrow canyons. They'd abandoned the creek bed an hour ago when fresh hoofprints suggested the Blackwood Gang was closing in. Now they moved in tense silence, their earlier exhaustion forgotten in the face of immediate danger. "Keep your feet where I put mine," Sarah instructed, her voice barely above a whisper. She moved like a shadow despite her injured ribs, each step carefully placed to leave minimal trace. Her old bay mare followed just as quietly, years of training evident in its behavior. Timothy Brooks watched closely, trying to memorize her technique. The merchant had never imagined he'd be learning tracking skills from the woman they'd once mocked as a desert ghost. Behind him, Hannah Wells supported Elizabeth Crawford, whose wound had begun bleeding again in the afternoon heat. "Hold up," Hank called softly from his position as rear guard. He knelt to examine something in the dust, a fresh cigarette but still warm. "They're parallel to us, using the high ground." Sarah's hand moved to her carbine, eyes scanning the ridge lines above. "Smart. They're trying to box us in." She studied the terrain ahead, mental calculations visible in her expression. "We need to split their attention." Marcus Reed checked his ammunition for the dozenth time. "How you figure we do that?" "There's a box canyon ahead," Sarah explained, pointing to a narrow gap between towering rock walls. "Looks like a dead end, but there's a hidden trail up the back wall. Most folks don't know about it. You want to trap us in there?" Billy Tucker's voice cracked with nervous tension. "No," Sarah replied, a hint of steel entering her tone. "I want to trap them. They'll think they've got us cornered. Make them overconfident, sloppy." She turned to face the group. "But it's your choice. It's a risky play." The travelers exchanged glances, weighing their options. The trust they developed in Sarah's judgment warred with their natural instinct to avoid being cornered. "What do you need us to do?" Hannah asked, breaking the silence. The others nodded in agreement, and Sarah's eyes showed a flicker of something, perhaps respect or gratitude. "First, we make it look like we're trying to hide our trail," she began, quickly outlining her plan. The next hour was spent carefully laying false tracks, making it appear as though an inexperienced group was attempting to conceal their passage. "Remember," Sarah instructed as they worked, "the gang's been doing this long enough to spot obvious tricks. We need to make our deception look like panic, not strategy." Mary Beth Crawford proved surprisingly adept at the subterfuge, her natural attention to detail helping create convincing signs of a group in disarray. Even Marcus set aside his pride to learn from Sarah's expertise, absorbing her lessons in wilderness craft with focused intensity. The sun was dipping toward the horizon when they reached the box canyon. The entrance was narrow, barely wide enough for two horses to walk abreast, and the walls rose nearly vertical on three sides. To anyone without knowledge of the hidden trail, it would indeed appear to be a dead end. "Perfect killing ground," Marcus observed grimly, understanding the tactical situation. "They'll think they've got us trapped in here like fish in a barrel." Sarah nodded, already moving to position the group. "The Crawford sisters and Hannah take the high trail first. You'll need time with that injured arm, Elizabeth. Timothy and Billy, help them with the horses. Hank, you and Marcus stay with me." "What about you?" Hannah asked, noting how Sarah held herself stiffly, her injured ribs clearly paining her. "I'll be fine," Sarah replied automatically, then caught herself at Hannah's skeptical look. "I've worked through worse." We don't have time for anything else. The next phase of Sarah's plan required painstaking preparation. She showed them how to arrange their gear, to create the impression of a larger group, how to position saddlebags to catch the last sunlight and cast misleading shadows. Every detail was calculated to draw their pursuers into a false sense of advantage. "They're coming," Hank reported from his observation post. 2 riders on the ridge, moving slow, looking for sign. Sarah's expression hardened. "Right on time. They'll want to wait for full dark before making their move." She turned to those preparing to take the hidden trail. "Once you're up top, find cover and stay quiet. No matter what you hear below, don't move until I signal." "What's the signal?" Billy asked, helping Elizabeth onto her horse. "Trust me, you'll know it," Sarah replied, checking her weapons one final time. "If something goes wrong—" She paused, considering her words carefully. "The mission ruins are 2 hours east once you clear the high ground. Father Michael will help you." Hannah caught Sarah's arm before mounting her horse. "Don't make us regret trusting you," she said softly. "Not after everything." A ghost of a smile touched Sarah's lips. "Been a long time since anyone trusted me with anything except violence." She stepped back, surveying her preparations with a critical eye. "Get moving. Daylight's wasting." The group split as planned, with most taking the hidden trail while Sarah, Marcus, and Hank remained below. The trail itself proved to be a masterpiece of natural concealment. A series of switchbacks hidden behind a fall of rock that looked solid from below. Sarah had promised it could handle horses if taken slowly, and she proved correct. As darkness fell, Sarah positioned herself and her remaining companions carefully. "They'll come from both ends," she predicted, her voice barely a whisper. "Try to catch us in a crossfire. Standard Blackwood tactics." "How many you figure?" Marcus asked, equally quiet. "At least 6, probably more," she replied. "They'll have learned from last night. Won't underestimate us again." She touched her ribs gingerly. "Which means we can't underestimate them either." The waiting was the hardest part. Minutes stretched into hours as full darkness descended. The moon was hidden behind clouds, leaving only starlight to illuminate the canyon. Every shadow seemed to move. Every whisper of wind carried the threat of approach. Sarah used the time to share more of her hard-earned knowledge. She taught them to listen for specific sounds: the clink of spurs, the soft scrape of leather on rock, the subtle differences between animal and human movement in the dark. Her lessons were precise, practical, delivered in the same quiet tone she used for everything. "Why do you really come back for us?" Marcus asked during one long stretch of silence. Truth this time. Sarah was quiet, so long he thought she wouldn't answer. When she did, her voice carried the weight of memory. "When the gang hit my family's ranch, they didn't just kill everyone they found. They took their time, made sport of it." She paused, controlling some emotion. "I tracked them afterward, found signs of what they'd done to other victims. Nobody deserves that kind of death. Even folks who mocked you as crazy?" Hank asked softly. "Especially them," she replied. "Proves you're better than what you're fighting against." Further conversation was cut short by a sound from the canyon entrance, the subtle shift of loose gravel under a cautious boot. Sarah touched each man's arm in silent warning, then seemed to melt into the shadows. The attack, when it came, was exactly as she predicted. Riders at both ends of the canyon, dismounted men working their way along the walls. They moved with professional skill, but Sarah had positioned her small force perfectly. The first sign that something was wrong came when one of the gang members found a saddlebag that turned out to be empty. By then, it was too late. Sarah's first shot dropped the nearest wall climber, while Marcus and Hank opened fire on the canyon entrance. Chaos erupted in the confined space. Horses reared and bolted, shots echoed deafeningly off the rock walls, and men shouted in confusion as they realized their prey had somehow turned the tables. Sarah moved like a ghost through the darkness, her knowledge of the terrain allowing her to strike and fade away before anyone could return fire. Above, the rest of the travelers watched in tense silence as the battle unfolded below. Hannah gripped her medical bag tightly, knowing her skills would be needed before the night was over. Billy Tucker found himself holding his breath each time Sarah appeared in a flash of gunfire, while Timothy studied her tactics with growing appreciation. The gang's numerical advantage proved less useful in the confined space, especially against opponents who knew exactly where they would attack from. One by one, they fell to precisely aimed shots or found themselves trapped in killing ground Sarah had carefully prepared. Then something went wrong. A gang member, more clever or lucky than his fellows, spotted the hidden trail. His warning shout was cut short by Hank's rifle, but the damage was done. The remaining attackers began working their way toward the concealed path. Sarah's voice cut through the darkness. Now, just like I showed you. The travelers above had been positioned with care, armed with loose rocks and debris. At Sarah's signal, they began raining down material, creating confusion and blocking the approach to the trail. The natural acoustics of the canyon amplified the noise, making it impossible to tell how many people were above. Taking advantage of the chaos, Sarah launched a final assault. Her movement was a blur of lethal efficiency, though Hannah could see she was favoring her injured side more heavily now. Within minutes, the remaining gang members were down or fleeing into the night. Clear. Sarah's voice echoed off the canyon walls. But we need to move. Now. The group reunited quickly, gathering what supplies could be salvaged. Sarah worked through obvious pain to check each fallen gang member, collecting useful ammunition and confirming kills with grim efficiency. 8, she reported tersely. 3 got away, probably headed back to their main camp. She straightened slowly, one hand pressed to her side. We've bought some time, but we need to reach the mission before they regroup. Hannah moved to check Sarah's ribs, but the tracker waved her off. Later. Movement's our priority now. She swung into her saddle, hiding a grimace. Stay close, follow my lead exactly. They'll be back with reinforcements, and they'll be angry. The group moved out under starlight, leaving the box canyon and its dead behind. Sarah set a brutal pace, pushing them and herself to their limits. She seemed to know every fold in the terrain, every hidden path that offered concealment. As they rode, Timothy found himself watching their mysterious protector with new eyes. The woman they dismissed as a crazy hermit had just orchestrated a masterful defense against superior numbers, all while protecting them and fighting through her own injuries. The stories didn't do her justice, he murmured to Hank as they rode. She's not just hunting them for revenge. This is something else. Hank nodded, understanding in his weathered features. Revenge burns fast, leaves you hollow. This here? He gestured to where Sarah rode point, scanning constantly for danger. This is responsibility. The weight of knowing you might be the only thing standing between good folks and monsters. The night grew deeper as they pressed on, each mile carrying them closer to the promised sanctuary of the mission ruins. Behind them, somewhere in the darkness, the survivors of the Blackwood Gang nursed their wounds and plotted revenge. But for now, at least, the travelers rode under the protection of their unlikely guardian, the woman they'd once mocked as a ghost who had proved to be something far more substantial, a shield between the innocent and the evil that hunted them. Dawn broke over a makeshift camp hidden in a deep arroyo, the morning light revealing the toll the night's journey had taken on the travelers. They'd ridden until the horses couldn't go any further, finally stopping when Sarah Mason found this natural shelter just before sunrise. Now, as the others rested, she methodically taught them the skills they'd need to survive. No sudden movements, Sarah instructed, showing Billy Tucker how to set a tripwire alarm using materials from the surrounding desert. Smooth and deliberate, like you're sure of every step. Hesitation catches the eye faster than action. The young merchant, who'd once mocked her as a witch, now watched with rapt attention. His hands, which had trembled during the canyon fight, were steady as he copied her technique. Like this? He asked, completing the setup. Sarah tested the wire with practiced fingers. Better. You're learning. There was no praise in her voice, just quiet acknowledgement of fact. Now show the others. Teaching reinforces learning. Across the camp, Hannah Wells finally convinced Sarah to let her examine the injured ribs. The tracker sat still as stone as Hannah's gentle hands probed the damage. But even her iron control couldn't hide the occasional sharp intake of breath. 2 breaks, maybe 3, Hannah reported grimly. You've made them worse, pushing yourself like this. Had no choice, Sarah replied simply. Still don't. But she allowed Hannah to bind her ribs properly, a small concession to necessity. Timothy Brooks approached with a steaming cup of coffee, Their supplies were dwindling, but he'd insisted on sharing. "Mr. Tucker's got a knack for those traps," he observed, offering the cup to Sarah. Never would have expected that from him. Sarah accepted the coffee with a slight nod. "Fear either breaks people or forces them to grow. He's choosing to grow." She took a careful sip, her sharp eyes never stopping their constant scan of the surroundings. "You all are." Indeed, the transformation of the travelers was becoming more evident with each passing hour. Marcus Reed, who'd once led with bluster and bravado, now moved with measured purpose as he helped Hank teach the others basic defensive positions. "Control your breathing," Marcus instructed Mary Beth Crawford as she practiced reloading under pressure. "Smooth movements save seconds. Seconds save lives." He caught Sarah watching and gave a slight nod, acknowledging how much he'd learned from her example. Elizabeth Crawford, her injured arm properly bandaged, insisted on learning one-handed shooting techniques. "I won't be helpless," she declared firmly. "Not again." Her sister stood ready to support her, their shared determination washing away their former helplessness. The morning wore on, and Sarah divided her time between teaching survival skills and scouting the surrounding area. She showed them how to read the desert itself, which plants could hold water, which rocks would hold heat for nighttime warmth, how to spot game trails that could double as escape routes. "Your horse," Timothy said during one lesson, watching Sarah's bay mare stand perfectly still despite the nearby activity. "She's something special." Sarah ran a hand along the mare's neck, a rare moment of gentleness. "Clara's been with me since before." She paused, memories darkening her eyes. "She knows what we hunt, understands the need for silence." When she thought no one was watching, Sarah spoke softly to Clara, quiet words meant only for the horse's ears. Timothy overheard fragments, not of vengeance or hunting, but of loneliness, of the weight of the path she'd chosen. It was perhaps the most human he'd seen her since their paths had crossed. As the day progressed, Sarah orchestrated complex training scenarios, using the natural terrain to create realistic challenges. The travelers learned to move as a unit, to communicate with hand signals, to read each other's intentions without speaking. "Why are you teaching us all this?" Billy asked during a brief rest. "Why not just get us to the mission and be done with it?" Sarah checked her weapons before answering, a habit as natural as breathing. "Because the trail doesn't end at the mission. The world's full of Blackwood gangs, just wearing different faces. Better you learn now, while someone's willing to teach." The afternoon brought new lessons in survival craft. Sarah demonstrated how to create decoys using local materials, tumbleweeds and branches arranged to cast misleading shadows, false trails that would waste a pursuer's time and energy. "The secret," she explained, positioning a branch just so, "is to think like your enemy. Know what they're looking for, then give them something almost right. Almost is often better than perfect, makes them waste time studying it." Hannah, taking a break from tending Elizabeth's wound, watched Sarah work. "You've been doing this a long time," she observed. "Not just tracking the Blackwoods, but teaching others to survive." Sarah's hands stilled for a moment. "Started after Mason County. Found other survivors, folks who'd lost everything to gangs like the Blackwoods. Taught them what I could." Her voice carried old pain. "Some wanted revenge. Taught them that too, when I had to. Better they learn to do it right than get themselves killed trying." The confession sparked something in the group, a deeper understanding of their protector's mission. She wasn't just seeking personal vengeance. She was trying to create ripples of resistance against the darkness that had claimed her family. As evening approached, Sarah gathered them for what she called night work, techniques for moving and fighting in darkness. She taught them to use their other senses, to feel changes in air currents, to recognize the different sounds of foot traffic on various surfaces. "Your eyes fool you at night," she explained, having them practice with blindfolds. "They see what they expect to see. But your ears, your skin, they don't lie if you learn to trust them." The lessons were interrupted by Clara's sudden alertness. Ears forward, nostrils flaring. Sarah was moving before the others registered any change, her rifle appearing in her hands like magic. "Riders," she announced quietly. "Still far off, but moving parallel to us. Scouts probably." She studied the terrain with calculating eyes. "Time to put your training to use." What followed was a masterclass in evasion tactics. Sarah led them through a series of maneuvers that seemed random, but were carefully planned to confuse any pursuit. They backtracked, split up, and rejoined, used dry stream beds and rock formations to mask their trail. "Watch how she does this," Hank muttered to Timothy as they worked. "She's not just hiding our trail. She's telling a story with it, making them see what she wants them to see." Indeed, Sarah was weaving a complex narrative in tracks and signs, suggesting a group larger than they were, moving in a direction they hadn't taken. Every broken branch and scattered stone was part of her deception. As night fell, they made camp in a different location, this time a natural cave that Sarah knew of. The day's training had left them exhausted, but changed. They moved differently now, thought differently, saw the world through new eyes. "Tomorrow," Sarah announced as they settled in, "we reach the mission. But tonight, you learn about watches." She assigned pairs, showing them how to maintain awareness without exhausting themselves. "Sleep light, but do sleep. Tired people make mistakes." During his watch, Timothy found Sarah checking Clara's tack by moonlight. The tracker's movements were precise despite her injuries, each action practiced until it was automatic. "Why did you really come back for us that first night?" he asked quietly, voicing the question that had nagged at him. "The whole truth this time?" Sarah continued her work for a moment before responding. "Because you reminded me of my family," she finally said. "They weren't perfect. Made mistakes. Judged folks too quick sometimes. But they were good people at heart." She straightened slowly, favoring her injured side. "The Blackwoods don't care if folks are perfect. They just enjoy destroying anything good they find." The night deepened around them, full of stars and desert sounds. The travelers took their watches in turns, each person changed by what they'd learned. They were no longer just merchants and wanderers. They had become students of survival, apprentices to a woman who had made it her life's work to stand against the darkness. Even Marcus, keeping watch with Hannah, showed how much he'd changed. "Never thought I'd learn more about tracking from someone I dismissed as a crazy hermit than from all my years of bounty hunting," he admitted quietly. Hannah smiled slightly as she checked her medical supplies. Sometimes the best teachers are the ones who've paid the highest price for their knowledge. Sarah Mason, the ghost tracker of Mason County, had given them more than just protection. She had given them the tools to protect themselves and others. In doing so, she had turned a group of frightened travelers into something more, extending her one-woman war against evil into a legacy that would live on through those she taught. As the night watches changed and the moon tracked across the sky, the travelers rested and prepared for what was to come. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but they would face them as changed people, stronger, wiser, and ready to stand against whatever darkness awaited them on the trail ahead. The abandoned mining camp sprawled before them like a wound in the canyon wall, its weathered structures casting long shadows in the late afternoon light. Sarah Mason lay prone on a ridge overlooking the hideout, studying the Blackwood Gang's fortress through her rifle's scope. Behind her, the travelers waited in tense silence, their newfound skills about to be put to the ultimate test. "Count 16 men that I can see," Sarah reported, her voice barely above a whisper. "Maybe more inside the buildings. They're nervous. Doubled their usual guard rotation since the canyon fight." Despite her controlled tone, she couldn't completely hide the grimace of pain as she shifted position to get a better view. Timothy Brooks crawled forward to join her, moving with the careful silence she'd taught him. The merchant's eyes had grown sharp over the past days, and he quickly picked out details of the gang's defenses. "They've got firing positions set up on both the old mill roof and the water tower," he observed. "Good fields of fire covering all approaches." "Good eye," Sarah acknowledged. "They're expecting us to come in force. Probably think we've gathered reinforcements from nearby settlements." A ghost of a smile touched her lips. "Their caution works in our favor. Makes them predictable." The sun continued its westward descent as Sarah laid out her plan to the assembled group. Using sticks in the dirt, she sketched the layout of the mining camp and assigned roles to each traveler based on their newly discovered strengths. "Hannah, you'll set up a medical station here." She indicated a sheltered hollow within running distance of the camp. "Mary Beth, you'll stay with her. Your steady hands will be needed for treating the wounded." Both women nodded grimly, already mentally preparing their limited medical supplies. "Elizabeth, even with that injured arm, You're our best shot with a rifle, Sarah continued. You'll take position on this ridge with Hank. Cover fire only, make them keep their heads down when we need it. The wounded woman straightened, determination overcoming pain. Marcus, you and I will approach from opposite sides. Sarah marked 2 paths in the dirt. Your bounty hunting experience finally gets put to good use. You know how men think when they're being hunted. Billy Tucker, who had shown an unexpected talent for stealth, received his own crucial role. You'll create diversions here and here. Sarah pointed to several locations. Nothing fancy, just enough noise and movement to draw attention where we want it. Timothy's merchant experience proved valuable in unexpected ways. The old mining office, he pointed to a building on their makeshift map. If they're following standard practice, that's where they'll keep their ammunition stores. Taking that out early would force them to conserve bullets. Sarah nodded approvingly. Good thinking. We'll add that to the primary targets. She turned to address the entire group. Everything we've practiced, everything you've learned, it all comes down to this. But remember, you're not soldiers, and I'm not asking you to be. Your job is to survive and help others survive. As the group dispersed to prepare, Hannah finally convinced Sarah to let her check the injured ribs. They're worse, the healer pronounced quietly. You can't keep pushing yourself like this. No choice, Sarah replied, but she accepted the fresh bandaging and willow bark tea for the pain. Need to end this before they gather more strength or move on to new hunting grounds. The next hours were spent in careful preparation. Sarah taught them to create improvised weapons and tools from the materials at hand. Empty bottles became noise makers, lengths of rope were transformed into trip lines, and common mining tools were repurposed into defensive implements. Remember, Sarah instructed as they worked, the gang expects a frontal assault. They're watching for an army, not a handful of travelers using their own territory against them. She demonstrated how to set up a simple but effective trap using an old minecart and leverage. Sometimes the best weapon is making your enemy defeat himself. The transformation of the travelers was never more evident than during these preparations. Billy Tucker, who had once been too frightened to stand his ground, now moved with quiet confidence as he rigged distractions. The Crawford sisters worked in seamless coordination, their previous helplessness replaced by grim determination. Even Marcus had changed, his former bravado transformed into measured professionalism. Never thought I'd say this, he admitted to Sarah as they discussed tactics, but I've learned more about real tracking and fighting in these past days than in all my years of bounty hunting. As dusk approached, Sarah gathered them for final instructions. The plan was complex but flexible, designed to adapt to whatever situation they might encounter. Each person knew their role and, more importantly, understood how their part fit into the larger strategy. What if someone loses their nerve? Billy asked, voicing the fear they all carried. Sarah's response was characteristically direct. Fear keeps you alive if you use it right. Let it sharpen your senses, not dull your mind. She checked her weapons with practiced efficiency. But if anyone wants to back out, now's the time. No shame in choosing to live. No one moved. The same people who had once mocked her as a crazy hermit now stood ready to follow her into battle. The irony wasn't lost on Sarah, though her expression remained unchanged. A tense quiet settled over the group as they made final preparations. Hannah organized her medical supplies with methodical care, while Elizabeth tested her ability to shoot one-handed from various positions. Mary Beth memorized the fastest routes between potential injury sites and the medical station. Timothy, watching Sarah check and recheck everyone's preparations, finally asked the question that had been nagging at him. Why are you trusting us with this? After how we treated you? Sarah paused in her work, considering her answer carefully. Because you've earned it, she said finally. Not through any one big action, but through all the small choices you've made since that first night. Each time you chose to learn instead of complain, to help instead of hide, to face the danger instead of run from it. The sun had nearly set when a complication arose. One of their lookouts spotted a traveler approaching the gang's hideout. James Wheeler, a merchant they'd briefly encountered days ago. They watched in tense silence as he was escorted into the camp. He's gone to warn them, Marcus growled, trying to buy his own safety with information about us. Sarah's expression hardened. Changes nothing. Just means we move sooner rather than later. She turned to the group. Everyone knows what to do. They nodded, each face showing a mixture of fear and determination. The past few days had prepared them for this moment, but theory was about to become deadly reality. One last thing, Sarah said, her voice carrying quiet authority. Whatever happens in there, remember, you're not fighting for revenge. You're fighting to stop them from hurting anyone else. That's the difference between justice and vengeance. As darkness fell, they moved into their positions. Sarah's bay mare, Clara, stood ready to provide a mobile platform for hit-and-run attacks. The old horse's training would prove invaluable in the chaos to come. Timothy watched Sarah check her weapons one final time, noting how she ignored the pain from her ribs. "What happens if we succeed?" he asked quietly. "After it's over? Then you go back to your lives," she replied, "but you go back changed. You'll know what's out there. And more importantly, you'll know how to stand against it." She mounted Clara with careful movement. That knowledge comes with responsibility. Use it wisely. The night deepened around them as they made final adjustments to their positions. Below, the mining camp buzzed with activity, the gang unaware that their hunters had become the hunted. Tomorrow, this place would become a battlefield, and these transformed travelers would face their ultimate test. Sarah's voice carried to each of them one last time as they separated. "Remember your training. Trust your instincts. Watch out for each other." She paused, then added something she rarely expressed. "I'm proud of what you've become." The same people who had once dismissed Sarah Mason as a desert ghost now stood ready to join her fight against the darkness. As they waited for the signal to begin, each traveler carried not just weapons and tools, but the weight of transformation, from victims to defenders, from frightened followers to determined allies. The night wind whispered through the canyon, carrying the promise of violence to come. But unlike their first encounter with danger, they were no longer unprepared. Sarah Mason had taught them well, and tomorrow would prove just how much they had learned. The pre-dawn darkness wrapped around the mining camp like a shroud, broken only by the occasional flicker of lantern light from the gang's sentries. Sarah Mason's plan was set in motion with a sound so subtle that the guards almost missed it. The soft clatter of loose rocks tumbling down the canyon wall, carefully orchestrated by Billy Tucker's skilled hand. The first sentry turned toward the noise, squinting into the darkness. His attention diverted exactly as Sarah had planned. He never saw the real threat until it was too late. The tripwire caught his ankle, sending him sprawling with enough noise to draw more guards to investigate. "Movement on the east ridge," someone shouted, spotting a shadow that was actually a carefully rigged decoy Sarah had taught them to create. More guards turned their attention east, falling perfectly into the trap. The first explosion rocked the mining camp. Timothy's contribution, using mining powder they discovered in an abandoned shaft. The blast wasn't meant to kill, but to create confusion and draw attention to the wrong places. The fire spread quickly to the ammunition stores, just as he had predicted it would. "We're under attack." The gang's shouts echoed off the canyon walls as they scrambled to defend against a threat coming from all directions and nowhere at once. Sarah's lessons in psychological warfare were bearing fruit. The gang couldn't tell if they faced an army or a handful of attackers. Elizabeth Crawford, positioned on the ridge with Hank, began picking off targets with surgical precision despite her injured arm. Her shots weren't meant to kill, but to wound and create chaos. "Keep them moving," Sarah had instructed. "A wounded man needs others to help him. Takes more fighters out of action." Marcus Reed emerged from the shadows on the opposite side of the camp from Sarah, exactly as planned. His bounty hunter skills, refined by Sarah's training, made him a ghost in the darkness. He took down 2 gang members before they realized he was there, then vanished again as their return fire hit empty air. The gang's leadership struggled to coordinate a response. James Wheeler's warning had made them expect a frontal assault from a large force, not this mysterious attack that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Their defensive positions, so carefully prepared, now worked against them as they couldn't tell friend from foe in the chaos. Sarah herself was a nightmare made real, appearing and disappearing throughout the camp. Her bay mare, Clara, moved with impossible silence, years of training evident in every step. Together, they were like a deadly wind, striking and vanishing before anyone could respond. "The ghost. She's everywhere." The cry went up from multiple directions as gang members caught glimpses of her. The fear in their voices was palpable. The legend they'd mocked had become death incarnate. Billy Tucker proved his worth 10 times over, using the skills Sarah had taught him to create confusion and misdirection. A noise here, a shadow there, each carefully timed to draw gang members into prepared kill zones. The young merchant who had once trembled at danger now orchestrated it like a conductor. Hannah Wells and Mary Beth Crawford worked with grim efficiency at their medical station, treating the wounded who made it to them. But they weren't just healers. They were also Sarah's eyes and ears, monitoring the flow of battle and sending signals to adjust the plan as needed. "They're trying to flank the north side," Mary Beth called out in the specific pattern of bird calls Sarah had taught them. The warning allowed Elizabeth and Hank to shift their fire, cutting off the attempted maneuver before it could develop. The gang's superior numbers meant nothing in the face of Sarah's strategy. Every time they tried to group up and mount an organized response, they found their paths blocked by traps or caught in devastating crossfires. The skills she'd taught the travelers turned the entire mining camp into a killing ground. Timothy Brooks, watching from his position, saw Sarah's plan unfold like a deadly chess game. Each move had been calculated, each response predicted. Even when things didn't go exactly as planned, the flexibility she'd built into their strategy allowed for adjustment. The gang's leader, a massive brute Sarah had identified as Jake Blackwood himself, finally emerged from the main building, roaring orders and trying to rally his men. He was an imposing figure, his scarred face twisted with rage as he realized how thoroughly he'd been outmaneuvered. "Find her. Find the ghost bitch." His voice boomed through the camp. $100 extra to the man who brings me her head." Sarah's response was immediate and devastating. A shot rang out, and Blackwood's gun hand exploded in a spray of blood and bone. As he staggered, cursing, more shots drove his would-be protectors away from him. Then she appeared, materializing from the shadows like the ghost they named her. Despite her injured ribs, Sarah moved with lethal grace as she approached the gang leader. The nearby fighting seemed to pause as everyone turned to watch the confrontation. "Remember me, Jake?" Sarah's voice carried clearly in the sudden quiet. "Remember Mason County? The ranch you hit first?" Recognition dawned in Blackwood's eyes, followed quickly by fear. "Mason? That was you." He tried to reach for his backup gun with his left hand, but Sarah's next shot put him on his knees. "You killed good people," Sarah continued, moving closer. "Not just at Mason County. Every trail, every settlement you've hit. But it ends here." Blackwood, despite his wounds, managed a bloody grin. "You think you can stop us? We're everywhere. Kill me. 2 more will take my place." He spat red onto the dirt. "You can't save everyone, Mason." "No," Sarah agreed, her gun unwavering. "But I can save everyone you would have killed." The shot echoed off the canyon walls with finality. The death of their leader broke something in the remaining gang members. Some threw down their weapons and surrendered. Others tried to flee, only to run into the carefully placed defenders Sarah had positioned to cut off escape routes. The battle wasn't quite over. Pockets of resistance remained, and some of the more devoted gang members fought on with desperate fury. But the outcome was no longer in doubt. Sarah's strategy, combined with the newly honed skills of the travelers, had turned a supposedly unassailable hideout into a trap for its defenders. Marcus proved especially effective in this phase of the battle, his bounty hunter experience helping him predict where fleeing gang members would go. He and Hank worked in concert, driving their quarry into prepared killing zones or forcing surrenders. Elizabeth's marksmanship continued to prove invaluable, her shots precise and deliberate despite her injury. She had learned Sarah's lessons well. No wasted ammunition, no shots taken unless success was certain. The gang members quickly learned to fear the crack of a rifle. Billy Tucker's moments of courage were less dramatic, but equally important. He moved through the chaos like a shadow, reporting enemy positions and maintaining the network of signals that kept their forces coordinated. The fear that had once ruled him had been transformed into focused action. Hannah and Mary Beth found their medical skills tested to the limit as wounded from both sides reached their station. They worked without discrimination, saving those they could, easing the passing of those they couldn't. Sarah had taught them this too, that mercy separated them from those they fought. Timothy coordinated the surrender of several gang members, his merchant's gift for negotiation proving surprisingly useful in talking down men who realized they'd lost everything. He found himself using phrases and techniques he'd learned from Sarah, turning opponents into prisoners without further bloodshed. The sun was rising by the time the last shots faded away. The mining camp, so recently a fortress of evil, had become a testament to justice. The travelers gathered slowly, checking injuries and securing prisoners, each bearing the weight of what they'd accomplished. Sarah moved among them, checking wounds and offering quiet words of approval or comfort. Despite her own injuries, she made sure each member of her improvised force was cared for before allowing Hannah to tend to her. "Never seen anything like it," Marcus said quietly to Hank as they helped secure the prisoners. The way she turned a handful of merchants and travelers into a fighting force. It's like she was building an army they couldn't see coming. Hank nodded, understanding in his weathered features. That's the real ghost they should have feared. Not the legend, but the skill to turn ordinary folks into something extraordinary. As they began the work of dealing with aftermath, tending wounds, securing prisoners, counting the cost, each traveler understood that they had become part of something larger than themselves. Sarah Mason, the ghost tracker they had once mocked, had led them not just to victory, but to a profound change in themselves. They had faced the darkness and emerged not just survivors, but defenders against it. As the morning sun painted the canyon walls in shades of gold and red, they began to understand that this end was also a beginning. The battle was won, but its echoes would ripple out through all their lives, carrying forward the lessons learned in blood and courage in the pre-dawn darkness of a desert mining camp. The morning sun had climbed high over the mining camp, casting harsh light on the night's violence. The acrid smell of gun smoke still hung in the air as the travelers worked to restore order to the chaos. In the makeshift infirmary they'd established in the old assay office, Hannah Wells tended to the wounded with fierce determination, though her hands trembled with exhaustion. Not everyone had survived the night. Young Peter Collins, a merchant who joined their group just days before, lay still beneath a blanket in the corner. He died protecting Mary Beth Crawford from a flanking attack, showing courage none of them had suspected he possessed. Sarah Mason stood over his body now, her face etched with the weight of command. "He knew the risks," Marcus said softly, approaching her. "We all did. Knowing doesn't make it easier," Sarah replied, her voice rough with fatigue and something deeper. "He was barely 20. Same age as my brother when—" She stopped, the memory catching in her throat. Hannah appeared at Sarah's side, her medical bag clutched like a shield. "Your ribs need attention. Now. No more excuses." This time, Sarah didn't resist, as the healer led her to a quiet corner for treatment. Timothy Brooks supervised the securing of prisoners, using skills Sarah had taught them to sort the truly dangerous from those who might be salvageable. The captured gang members sat in groups, watched over by armed travelers who bore their newfound authority with grim determination. "Most of these men aren't true believers," Timothy reported to Sarah as Hannah worked. "They joined for easy money or because they had nowhere else to go. A few, though," he nodded toward a separate group, heavily guarded. "Those are the ones who enjoyed it. The ones who followed Blackwood for the cruelty." Sarah's eyes narrowed as she studied the prisoners. "The cruel ones go to territorial prison. No deals, no mercy. The others—" She winced as Hannah tightened a bandage. "The others get a choice. Help bring down similar gangs, or face trial for their part in this." As the morning wore on, more details of the night's battle emerged. Elizabeth Crawford, her injured arm now properly splinted, worked with Hank to map out where each skirmish had taken place. Their methodical documentation would prove valuable for future law enforcement efforts. Billy Tucker, who had proven himself so thoroughly during the fight, discovered a hidden cache of documents in the gang's headquarters. Letters, he reported, bringing them to Sarah. Communications with other gangs. Supply arrangements. Names of collaborators in settled territories. Sarah's eyes sparked with cold purpose as she reviewed the papers. "This is what I needed. Proof of how far the rot has spread." She looked up at the young merchant who had once mocked her. "Good work. Very good work." As noon approached, a dust cloud on the horizon announced the arrival of a cavalry patrol, led by none other than the legendary Texas Ranger, John McBride. Sarah had sent word to him before the battle, one professional recognizing the need for official sanction. McBride dismounted slowly, his weathered face taking in the scene before him. His eyes settled on Sarah with a mix of respect and old familiarity. "Should have known it was you, Sarah. Nobody else could have turned a bunch of merchants and travelers into a fighting force capable of this." "They did the hard part themselves, John," Sarah replied, standing carefully to greet him. "I just showed them how." The Rangers' presence brought an official dimension to their victory. He took statements, documented evidence, and arranged for the transfer of prisoners. Throughout it all, he treated Sarah and the travelers not as vigilantes, but as legitimate allies in the fight against lawlessness. "What you've built here," McBride said privately to Sarah as they watched the prisoners being loaded into wagons, "it's more than just taking down one gang. You're creating a network, aren't you? Teaching others to defend themselves, to recognize the signs before violence finds them." Sarah's silence was answer enough. McBride nodded thoughtfully. "The Rangers could use that kind of preparation in the settlements. Might be time to make your work official." "I work better in the shadows, John. You know that." "Maybe," he conceded. "But shadows need structure too, if they're going to last." As the afternoon progressed, Sarah gathered the travelers for what would prove to be an emotional revelation. In the cool shade of the assay office, she finally shared the full story of what had brought her to this point. "Mason County wasn't just about losing my family," she began, her voice quiet but carrying to every corner. "It was about losing faith in the idea that someone else would come to help. The Rangers were stretched thin, the Army was focused on Indian conflicts, and the local law was often corrupt or cowardly." She paced slowly, each word measured. "I tracked the gang that hit our ranch, learned everything I could about how they operated, found others who'd survived similar attacks, started teaching them what I'd learned." A ghost of a smile touched her lips. "Some called me crazy. A woman alone, hunting killers? Had to be mad." "We thought the same," Timothy admitted. "When we first saw you on the trail, we were so wrong." Sarah acknowledged this with a slight nod. Being underestimated became a tool. "The gang members I tracked never expected real resistance from their victims. Never thought the sheep might learn to bite back." Hannah, who had been listening intently, suddenly understood something. "That's why you didn't just kill them all. Why you gave some a chance to surrender. You're building something larger than just revenge." "Justice without mercy is just another form of violence," Sarah confirmed. "The ones who can be turned, who can be shown a better path, they become part of the solution. Many of my best informants are former gang members who chose to change." The revelation cast their entire journey in a new light. The travelers began to understand that they hadn't just participated in taking down one gang. They had become part of a larger movement, a hidden network of resistance against the lawlessness that plagued the frontier. Marcus Reed, the bounty hunter who had learned true tracking from the woman he'd once dismissed, stood thoughtfully. "What happens now? To us, I mean?" Sarah's response was characteristically direct. "That depends on you. Some of you will return to your lives, better prepared to protect yourselves and others. Some might choose a different path." Her eyes met each of theirs in turn. "The skills you've learned, the experience you've gained, they come with responsibility." The Crawford sisters exchanged a look of silent communication before Mary Beth spoke. "Teach us more," she said simply. "We want to help others the way you helped us." Others nodded in agreement. The transformation they had undergone was too profound to simply walk away from. They had become something more than mere travelers. They were now carriers of Sarah Mason's legacy, potential teachers in their own right. As evening approached, they held a proper burial for Peter Collins. Sarah spoke words over his grave that none of them would ever forget. He died not just fighting against evil, but standing for something better. In the end, that's the only death that holds meaning. Sarah Mason was more than just a vengeful survivor or a mysterious tracker. She was the architect of a quiet revolution, teaching ordinary people to stand against extraordinary evil. As the sun set over the mining camp, now transformed from a place of darkness to a symbol of resistance, the travelers began to see their future paths more clearly. Some would return to their original lives, carrying Sarah's lessons with them. Others would join her hidden network, becoming teachers and protectors in their own right. Sarah watched them from the doorway of the assay office, her injured ribs finally properly tended, her purpose more evident than ever. She had lost one family in Mason County, but here in the aftermath of battle, she had gained another, not bound by blood, but by shared purpose and understanding. The night settled over the canyon, bringing with it not the fear of previous evenings, but a sense of possibility. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new battles to fight, new lives to protect. But tonight, they had earned their rest, secure in the knowledge that they had become part of something larger than themselves. 1 year had passed since the battle at the mining camp. The autumn wind swept across the plains of Mason County, rustling through the tall grass that had grown over the site of Sarah Mason's family ranch. The wooden crosses marking the graves had weathered with time, but they stood straight and true, tended by caring hands. Sarah sat astride Clara, her loyal bay mare now showing touches of gray around the muzzle, as she surveyed the changes time had brought. The ranch house had been rebuilt, not as a home, but as something more important, a training ground for those who would stand against the darkness she had spent so long fighting. "Thought I'd find you here," came a familiar voice. Marcus Reed rode up beside her, his former bounty hunter swagger replaced by the quiet confidence of a man who had found his true calling. "New groups arriving tomorrow. Hannah sent me to make sure you hadn't forgotten." Sarah's lips curved in a slight smile. "Hannah knows I never forget. She just worries." The healer had become the heart of their operation, treating both physical and spiritual wounds with equal skill. Her infirmary was always open, no questions asked, to those who needed help. The past year had transformed them all in ways none could have predicted. Timothy Brooks had returned to his merchant routes, but with a new purpose. His trading network now served as an early warning system, gathering information about gang activities and potential threats. His careful reports had helped prevent 3 major attacks on settlements. "Got word from Elizabeth Crawford yesterday," Marcus reported as they rode toward the training compound. "She and Mary Beth have established quite the reputation in the Northern Territories. Seems their school for proper young ladies is actually turning out some of the finest scouts and defenders we could ask for." The Crawford sisters had taken Sarah's lessons about hiding in plain sight to heart. Their finishing school served as the perfect cover for teaching women the skills they needed to protect themselves and their communities. More than one would-be attacker had learned too late not to underestimate their graduates. Billy Tucker, once the most frightened of their group, had found his courage and purpose in teaching others. His talent for setting traps and creating diversions had evolved into a comprehensive system for settlement defense. "Sometimes the best fight is the one that never happens," he would tell his students, echoing Sarah's wisdom. As they approached the compound, signs of activity were everywhere. Hank's shooting range echoed with controlled fire as he drilled new recruits in the art of precision over power. The old wanderer had found his home at last, passing on the skills that had helped them survive that fateful night. "Father Michael sent another group south last week," Marcus mentioned, referring to the priest who had turned his mission into a way station for their network. "Said they showed real promise. Even included a former gang member who wants to make amends." Sarah nodded approvingly. Redemption had become as much a part of their work as resistance. Many who had once ridden with gangs now served as their most valuable allies, their intimate knowledge of outlaw methods helping to prevent future attacks. The compound itself was a testament to how far they'd come. What looked like a simple ranching operation to casual observers was actually a carefully designed training facility. Every building, every corral, every seemingly random feature served a purpose in preparing others for the work ahead. They dismounted at the main house, where Hannah Wells emerged to greet them. Time had added silver threads to her hair, but her eyes were as kind and determined as ever. "The Rangers sent another request," she said without preamble. "They want to make our arrangement official." Sarah had been dancing around this issue for months. John McBride had kept his word about supporting their work, but pressure was growing to formalize their relationship with the law. The successes they'd had were too significant to ignore. "Tell them what we always tell them," Sarah replied, but there was less certainty in her voice than before. "We work better in the shadows." "Maybe," Hannah countered gently, "but the shadows are getting crowded. More people need what we can teach them. Having official sanction wouldn't change who we are or how we work." Inside the main house, maps covered one wall, marking known gang territories and suspected routes. But unlike the past, these maps now showed something new: points of light representing trained defenders, safe havens, and communities that could protect themselves. "Got something else you should see," Marcus said, producing a letter. "Came by special courier." Sarah recognized the handwriting immediately. Timothy's precise merchant script. The letter detailed a pattern of movement along the border, suggesting that a new gang was trying to establish itself in the territory. But unlike the past, this information came with annotations from multiple sources: Elizabeth's scouts, Billy's trap makers, even notes from reformed outlaws who now serve their cause. "They're not just passing on information," Marcus observed. "They're teaching others how to gather it. The network's growing on its own now." Sarah stood at the window, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson. She thought about that night a year ago, when a group of frightened travelers had discovered their own strength under her guidance. "We'll need to split the next training group," she decided. "Send half north with the Crawford sisters. Keep half here. Start rotating our instructors between locations." She turned to face her companions. "It's time we expanded." Hannah smiled knowingly. "I'll send word to John McBride. Tell him we're ready to discuss terms for limited official recognition. On our conditions." The night deepened, and lamps were lit in the compound's windows. In one building, new recruits learned about tracking from Marcus. In another, Hannah taught basic medicine and wound care. The sound of Hank's evening shooting class echoed across the yard. Sarah made her evening rounds, checking on each aspect of their operation. She passed the memorial wall where Peter Collins' name hung alongside others who had fallen fighting the darkness. Their sacrifices had not been in vain. Each name represented lessons learned, improvements made, lives saved. In the stable, she spent a moment with Clara, the horse who had carried her through so many battles. "We're not alone anymore, old friend," she whispered, stroking the mare's graying muzzle. "Took a while, but we found our way." A rider approached in the darkness, one of Timothy's couriers, bringing news from the trading routes. Soon, others would arrive seeking training, shelter, or a chance at redemption. The work would continue, as it had for the past year, building something stronger than any one person. Sarah Mason, the ghost tracker who had once ridden alone, now stood at the center of a growing web of protection and justice. The travelers who had mocked her had become teachers in their own right, each contributing to a legacy that would outlive them all. As she walked back to the main house, Sarah remembered that first encounter on the trail, the ridicule, the dismissal, the judgment. The memory no longer carried pain, only appreciation for how far they had all come. From that handful of frightened travelers had grown an army of shadows, invisible until needed, always ready to stand against those who would prey on the innocent. The final act of their journey had not been an ending, but a beginning. The story of the ghost tracker and the travelers who learned to fight back had spread, becoming legend in its own right. But unlike most legends, this one left behind more than just tales. It left a network of prepared defenders, a system of mutual protection, and a legacy of ordinary people learning to stand against extraordinary evil. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, more students to train, more threats to face, more lives to protect. But tonight, Sarah Mason stood in the doorway of the home she had built from tragedy and triumph, watching her unlikely family of defenders prepare for whatever battles lay ahead. The moon rose over Mason County, casting silver light over the training compound. In settlements across the territory, graduates of their program kept watch, ready to protect their communities. Former gang members walked new paths of redemption, while merchants and travelers carried warnings and wisdom along their routes. Their journey had begun with fear and mockery on a dusty trail, but it had led them to something far greater than any of them had imagined. The ghosts they had mocked had become a beacon of hope, and the travelers who had doubted had become legends in their own right. As the night settled over the compound, Sarah finally allowed herself a moment of pride. The darkness that had claimed her family still existed, but it no longer rode unopposed. In every territory, in every settlement, there were now those who knew how to stand against it. The legend of the ghost tracker had evolved into something more powerful than one woman's quest for justice. It had become a movement, a promise, and a legacy that would endure long after those first travelers had passed into history. The final chapter of their story had become the first chapter of countless others, each carrying forward the lessons learned on that fateful trail where a group of travelers had mocked a mysterious woman, only to discover she would transform them into something extraordinary. Some say she still rides the western trails on her old bay mare, finding those who need her most. Others claim her legacy lives on through the network of defenders she created, ordinary people who learned to be extraordinary. But perhaps the real question isn't what happened to the ghost of Mason County. The real question is, who's watching your trail, teaching others to fight back while you dismiss them as nothing to fear? If you enjoyed this tale of justice and redemption in the Old West, make sure to like and subscribe for more stories that'll keep you on the edge of your seat. And don't forget to ring that bell, because just like Sarah Mason, you never know when the next legend might come riding in.